think we'll get cracking, Sue. So my name's Dee Corrigan, and I held the role of Head of Corporate Engagement here at Blueprint for over 2 years now. Through that work, I work closely with companies we support, but I also help shape the future direction of our work here at Blueprint too. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Sue Garrard. Sue was, until August 2018, or autumn 2018, EVP of Sustainable Business and Communications at Unilever. Drawing on her leadership and experience in sustainability and purpose, Sue is now pursuing a portfolio career, working with large multinational companies and also some startup projects on a pro bono basis, all with the aim of helping companies get to the future faster and be part of the solution for the sustainability crisis of our time. Sue is also a founder of Blueprint and became our chair of the trustees in 2020. She is a fellow at the University of Cambridge Sustainability Leadership Institute, CISL. And today, I'm very glad that Sue will be joining me to share practical insights to help people and business take action on climate and social issues. Just a very brief bit of housekeeping, and anyone who's been to our other webinars will have heard me say this before, but this webinar is being recorded and we will be sharing a link to the recording after the event. We're planning to open up to discussion for audience around 17:45, 17:50. If you would like to ask a question, I would ask you to submit that via the Q&A facility. So that's the Q&A, not the messaging function on your Zoom app during the discussion. Unfortunately, we will only be able to call on a few, but when I do, the team here, so that's Sula and Amelia who are working behind the scenes, will unmute you and you will be able to ask your question live. So I'm going to get started with the conversation now because I have so much that I want to ask Sue and discuss with Sue today. But before we jump into some of those questions, Sue, can you give us a brief overview of your work and also, quite importantly, why you do what you do?
Yeah, well, I won't embroider very much on your introduction because it painted a kind of a picture. I guess I decided not to go off and do another big job when I left Unilever because a very good friend of mine said, look, having led the sustainability charge in the sustainable business role at Unilever, you probably don't quite realise that you're in quite an unusual position of being a very senior practitioner that actually knows how you actually do it in real life in a big company, rather than being a consultant or a think tank or academic or whatever. And the world is waking up to the fact it desperately needs the kind of help that it can give. And that's what made me decide, to be honest, rather terrifyingly, after 35 years of being on PAYE, to just kind of, it was like going off and doing your first dive off the top board. It was fairly unnerving. But I think I realised, Dee, most fundamentally, that all I was interested in now was one word: impact. How could I have the maximum impact given the state the world was in? How could I use the privilege of the background and what I had learned? And how could I also use the quite unusual permission that I have to both advise and really challenge and push companies to be more ambitious, to move faster, to take bigger risks, and to stretch themselves? And how could I do that in a way that still anchored it in the viability of that business? And I realized very quickly, actually, there are relatively few people that have that permission because it comes from having actually done it and it actually working at Unilever. So that was really, my experience there was a gift. And so where I see small organizations that either never will or at the moment don't make money that I think can have a big impact, then I work with them to try and help them. As you know, I pour a lot of time into Blueprint, sheer love, and have been on that journey right from the start. But it's really all about impact and being highly practical and highly applied on the one hand, but completely issue and principle and belief driven on the other side, and those two coming together.
Thank you, Sue. And I'm really interested in this idea of impact and belief, and how those two things can kind of come together. When we talk to companies about becoming purpose-led, we often make the statement that doing so is actually a choice, and to be really clear in the choice that you are making. What are the critical questions any executive team should ask themselves in making the choice to become purpose-led, in your view?
Yeah, well, I think the most fundamental question is why, obviously. And it's interesting because when you break that down, I think that 3 years ago, the why question was the predominant question across principle, which sits for me right at the heart of this, shifts on environmental behaviours, and shifts on social impact. We're now just in the space of the last 2 years in a different world. And so executive teams generally don't need to and are not asking the why question around the environmental bit of that. They are still struggling with the social side of that. And I hope we can unpick that a bit later, because they're two very, very different sides of the purpose picture. But ultimately, and I said this to a recent client who want to go on a purpose journey, and it was very clear to me from the way that they talked about it in quite a small senior group that they hadn't really worked out the why. And if you don't work that out, there's no way you're going to crack it. And actually what it can do is deepen rather than resolve tensions in the leadership team. And I always say, and anybody listening to this will find repeatedly that I boil things down to a very simple level, because I think you have to do that in order to get a handle on what are otherwise very complex issues. And that's how you make things actionable. So in practice, there are really basically, in my personal experience, right from the start of my career, two types of organisation. There are organisations that exist to maximise profit, and that's perfectly legal. And they may happen to be making dishwashers or legal advisors or repairing cars. It doesn't matter what sector they're in. And in a way, it doesn't sort of matter to them what sector they're in. They're not doing it because their overarching reason is to love making dishwashers. It's to make money. There's that kind of company, maximize profit. And then the second kind of company tends to be founded by people who have a passion for a topic or for helping a particular group of society. And a lot of them want to be the best at what they do. And they believe that if they pursue that passion and they meet the needs of whichever audience it is that they've got in mind as they build the business, and they seek to excel, that the money will follow. And I think that companies need to be really honest with themselves right from the start, which of those two buckets they're in. Because if you're in the second bucket, crudely speaking, you've got most of the, and a lot of these are latent or innate, but nevertheless, however innate and latent they are, you've got a lot of the latent underpinnings for going on the purpose journey already.
Yeah.
If you're in the first bucket, then my main advice is don't kid yourself that will be woven like Brighton through a stick of rock into your company DNA. And you've got to be super sure that that business model isn't working for you anymore, for you to walk away from it, because it's human nature and the power of the collective will just take you right back to your center of gravity all the time, unless, frankly, either you have a dramatic change of leadership, which is one of the catalysts to re-question that, which of those buckets you sit in, or you have a crisis that says, actually, we're now really in the poo and we need to look hard at whether our business model may have done very well getting us here, but is it going to get us there as a result of this crisis? So that really is, and there are lots of other things, but that is the most central, fundamental place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, you mentioned there about the why, and sometimes if there's not clarity of the why, it can deepen the tensions. And I think through our work, a lot of what we're trying to do is have that conversation more explicit. And I've heard you talk about sometimes in the boardroom or in the executive suite, you can have this sense of conscious denial. What is that for you? And how does that
Yeah,
come about?
It's very linked, I think, and it's particularly kind of palpable in this, I nearly said post-COVID, but of course it's nowhere near post, but in the kind of, now we're getting used to COVID and the impacts of COVID, the shockwaves of it have been felt. Because what's happened through COVID is that people have become super aware of basic things like the importance of friend and family, the sense of dependence that we actually have on community, the fragility of our relationship with nature, nature's ability to draw us out of ourselves and to give us hope and ground us and give us joy from very simple things. You know, these are very profound things about the state of humanity that have happened in the last, to a lot of people. Of course, they've been happening forever, but I mean in a very concentrated way. They've shot way up people's level of awareness. And that's great, but people are not quite sure kind of where that fits in what might be a return to a slightly more normal life. The reason I say all that is it's a long context for answering your question, Dee, which is that most senior leaders are absolutely brilliant at doing a number of things that a lot of us find very difficult. The first is they're very good at holding two deeply conflicting views in their mind at the same time. And they're also very good at being part of a collective where, as a member of the human race, they know fairly profoundly that something really isn't quite the right thing to do. But with their corporate hat on, driven by whatever the corporate entity thinks is the right thing to do, they are very consciously capable, and for the very long term, of burying that and dealing with the conflict between their true self and their personal values and what being part of that corporate entity or club requires. And I'm, you know, constantly reminded of how much of that conscious denial of your own genuine belief system people have done. And my instinct and my hope is that what COVID will have done is to make people less tolerant of dealing with that conflict and to help them understand, you know, to do a certain degree of not just temporary, but long-term recentering about what really matters and about the state of humanity and our relationship with other people, with communities, and with this amazing planet that we are amazingly managing to destroy. Well, we're not destroying the planet, we're destroying our ability to live on it.
Yeah. And I think whenever, you know, I think one of the reflections from my work is that, you know, the work around purpose and becoming a purpose-led organization is about transforming that organization. But I also think it transforms the people and the leaders in particular. And part of that is bringing into greater awareness this conscious denial.
Yeah. And so you have to be quite a brave leader, because at some level, individually and collectively, and you know, it starts at the top. It's absolutely not all about the top. But, you know, if a collective sense of leadership won't individually and collectively look in the mirror and acknowledge the profound areas of why change is needed and what the benefits of that could be, then you're really only popping some lipstick on a pig, quite honestly.
Yeah. So it reminds me a little bit of the story of Christmas Carol. And actually, this kind of leads on, there's quite a more specific practical question, but I think it talks to the point as well. But you know, it's this relationship, I guess, between purpose and profit and ESG. But I think we're hearing, you know, somewhat anecdotally that leadership teams are increasingly feeling like they're being distracted by this ESG stuff and are not spending enough time on the hard P&L. How do you invite leaders to think about this connection between ESG, purpose, and P&L?
Yeah. So look, there are 2 or 3 things bound up in that which drive me bonkers. I'm not bonkers at you, Dee, by the way. I'm bonkers at the kind of the generic assumptions that you've just encapsulated.
Yeah.
The first is that ESG is basically just, I say just, is about compliance. And if you come to this with a compliance mentality, that is not about purpose and really how you create a better world. So it comes back to what I said right at the start. You know, what's your belief and your intent? And there are people that actually believe that the purpose of an organization is to meet the needs of the world and to improve our ability to live together and on it. And people who believe that they're there to make money. So, you know, if your intent is simply to stay the right side of a regulatory line, then you're not going into this in the right spirit. And that's the compliance mentality. And I'm really not, I understand it, but I'm not really very interested in that. I'm interested in leaders who have woken up and gone, my God, business is probably one of the most significant sectors, much more so at speed than government, and much more so than NGOs, who are very good at dramatizing the problem but can't actually solve them, at driving positive change. And let's not get into a blame thing about how we got here in the first place, because that's a whole different topic. But businesses can absolutely now be an active force for good. And so it comes back to your point about this is a choice, right? So leadership teams that make an active choice about the role that they want to play in the world, when they really understand the world that we live in now and what our future looks like unless we take some action, they should find pretty quickly that there is no difference between operating what I call very simply a responsible, purpose-led business and operating a successful business. It's just that change process is hard. Well, all change processes are hard. That's why you need to be clear what your belief and your intent is in the first place. And people who see there being a binary choice, do we do the right thing or do we deliver for the short term, are really saying that they believe that an unsustainable, non-purpose-led organization is a viable long-term business model. And I'm afraid I've got news for them, which is that is a very flawed basis on which to run an organization. Employees won't want to work with it. We're seeing that incredibly rapidly now in some sectors, and it will spread. But more fundamentally, you'll get massive regulation and tax if you don't respond to the very real negative impacts of your corporate operations. And consumers are moving so fast on this, and investors are, you've seen Larry Fink in his annual letter saying, I'm going to walk away from businesses that don't demonstrate clearly that they have got a grip on their environmental impacts, particularly around climate, and have mitigations in place, because I can't judge that's a good long-term business. So it's completely flawed to say, do we do the responsible thing or do we deliver the short-term profit? What intelligent leaders are increasingly understanding is you need to understand how the two integrate to make you more resilient and future-proof. That's where the sweet spot lies for business leaders.
And we often use the phrase, what's better for people, better for society, better for business. And I think in the longer term, and you take a step back and you look at it more holistically in the interdependence, you know, we truly believe that that is the case. However, I think there can sometimes be this challenge of the generality of the win-win mentality that doesn't quite chime with some of the very difficult decisions that need to be made during that change process that you mentioned.
Yeah, but you know, that's what business leaders are there for. If every decision was a simple decision, well, you wouldn't need a guy on, you know, £1 million a year, would you? Because in the end, you can get all the data and all the analysis and all the forecasts and all the precedents you like. But ultimately, leadership's partly about judgment and choices, you know, and every judgment or choice you make, if you pay more on this, you pay less on that. Do you protect your margin? Are you going for top line growth? Are you trying to deliver bottom line as well? How do you manage the two? Where do you economize? Where do you invest? How confident are you that any, particularly capital investment, is going to yield? That's what business is. This just happens to be a different topic on which you have to take those judgments. And of course, the really difficult thing, and quite often the elephant in the room with these leadership teams, is they're really good at doing all that stuff in their core business because they've done it for 30 years, because usually you've been in the business for about 30 years by the time you get to the leadership team. This stuff, completely new to them. They have no personal basis of experience to fall back on.
Yeah.
And that's a very exposing situation to be in. And if you're a listed business and you've got pension funds buying you and, a grandmother's personal funding stability and heaven only knows what else, it's very intimidating.
And I think that kind of comes to another question I have, which is around leadership and the skills and the capability that are required now, as companies evolve in this area. What's your thoughts on that? And what can companies do to can they do anything to build out that skills or capability, or does it all come down to a sense of belief that you have that's inherent?
No, there's a hard, people have to do the hard yards, and the good people do that, and it's transformational, and it really starts with a willingness to be more aware than a lot of company leaders are, which means making the time mentally, emotionally, and physically to understand the world that we're in and to understand the impacts of the way that we live our life and to look at the forecasts. I do a regular session when I start any client project now, where we go away for a day and we immerse ourselves. And it is, I'd say, pretty much 100% consistent, where when I lay out the rate of deforestation, what's happening with biodiversity, the impact of the continuing growth of plastic waste in the sea and landfill, what the various sources of greenhouse gases are, carbon in particular, what the trajectory is, what that does for living conditions, what's happening with soil erosion, lack of water, chronic water stress already in significant parts of the world, and the projections around that, and what the consequences will be, very, very soon. I mean, there are already consequences, but, on a much bigger scale, very soon in the do nothing scenario, carry on as we are. Not a single business leader that I've worked with, across major multinational companies has done anything other than go, my God, I had no idea. And actually, when you have a leader, if you have a leadership group that is open, becomes open, that's the first prerequisite. And then what you need to do, of course, is you need to understand what your organization's contribution to the positive and negative is now, and what it could be. And you need to tease through the hundreds of issues that get thrown at you and get to the most material. Then the leaders need to go on a very practical learning journey about what they can do about that, and how much it will cost, and where will there be upsides, because very few people talk about upsides, but actually there are quite a lot. Possible opportunities to improve competitiveness, what the cost of inaction will be. So a client that I'm working with at the moment, for example, we calculated the best case scenario, the smallest number, within the next 5 years, just on carbon tax exposure, would be $500 million a year. That's a big old chunk out of margin. So when you can get to a point where they start to understand what their material issues are, the cost of inaction, and then it's really working with them in intensive coaching. Sorry, the dogs are bored stiff of me talking already. Hang on, I'm going to shut this door.
That's Indy. We're very lucky that Indy sometimes joins our meetings. She's beautiful. He's beautiful.
Sometimes on the screen. So that then I've found when you work with the leadership team, it's a fairly intensive coaching process, but most senior leaders are capable of orientating themselves. They don't need to be subject matter experts. There are lots of people in the company that can do that. they're capable of orientating themselves at the level they need in anything between 6 months to a year.
Yeah.
And, you know, that turns out to be one of the most worthwhile investments that most of them make. And they come back and they say, my God, I'm having different conversations around my dinner table at home. And of course, they're doing it with a family because they've all been locked in a room or a house, whatever. So it's quite life-changing.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you know, your first point was really that willingness and that desire to be open. And, you know, I think people worry about the capability or the subject matter expertise, but actually it's really the openness and all of, you know, there's a lot out there that we can do and use once you have that openness to change. And I certainly think I've noticed that working across different companies. Some are a little bit more introverted, I would say, than others, just kind of look inward and don't look out to actually the world that's changing around them and quite rapidly. So it's really interesting, as I'm sure you're seeing in your consultancy role, the differences across different companies.
Absolutely.
So you mentioned there some of the tipping points and planetary boundaries that we're now, you know, really, I guess we've got this 10 years really to make an impact. And one of the biggest areas is around net zero. And I'd love your thoughts on how companies can really think about the net zero targets that they put into play. And I guess I have one concern that, you know, net zero starts to become synonymous with greenwashing. And I just want your views, I guess, as an employee or customer, pension fund holder. What should we be looking out for in holding companies to account on some of their net zero? How do we make sure that they're not just kicking the can down the road and their surface level targets? Yeah. So what have you seen in that whole area? That was a massive amount of compounding questions. Apologies.
Yes. Okay, I'll have a go at it. I'm not a fan of net zero. Let me start there. That's not a philosophical, I don't like the phrase, or it's indistinct. Anything that's a target in 2050 in business world is just a joke. You can make whatever pledges you like. You'll have been through on average 6 CEOs by the time some poor bugger gets to be accountable for it. What matters is what we do now. You know, and if you think that the level of economic activity that happened in 2020 with the global corporate handbrake on was barely enough to equate to the in-year level of compound reduction we need in carbon emissions. You just think about that for a moment, the scale of everything just shuddering to a halt. It's terrifying. Honestly, it's terrifying how, you know, God, I love Greta Thunberg, but, you know, she's right to be just beyond incensed because we're still all doing far too much talking and not acting exactly as she says, like our house is on fire. So the key point here really is, and for everybody listening into this, if you do one thing as a result of this, go back. If you're in consultancy, do this with your clients. If you run a business, do it for yourself. And just ask yourself, are we going to halve our carbon emissions for our whole value chain, not just our own operations, by 2030? And if you're not, you need to. And if you want your kids and your grandkids to have a planet that's habitable in anything remotely like the way we live on this planet now, everybody's got to do their fair share and more. And by the way, I think from all the new data that is coming out, that IPCC guidance around halving in 10 years now looks at the very, very conservative end. You know, we've had an average temperature increase now of 1.2 degrees. So this is existential. Some people argue about whether we're too late or not. Let's not get into that because it's just not helpful. But we either just give up now and say, you know, let's go to 4 degrees and have a small island which a few people can live on, or we pull our fingers out. So that's just set what I'm going to say about, you know, how do you hold companies to account in context, but that's what they should be doing. You know, and I now will not work with any client that won't look at a full value chain halving of emissions. As you know, I work with both Lloyds and NatWest on this, and both of them made that commitment. And that's critical because between them, you know, the value of their lending book represents 50% of UK GDP. Well, and they've both got brilliant teams driving that. That's the kind of concrete action and commitment. And we've seen the way they are making very, very bold policies at high speed in a way that's very counterculture in that sector. And I say that first to praise them, and B, to say, if stuffy old banks can do it, you know, stereotype, we can all do it, and we have to. So how do we hold these companies to account? Very simple. What companies should be publicly reporting on every single year now is what their 2030 target is across their own operations, upstream and downstream, so suppliers and customers, what they expect the arc of change to be in terms of the reduction of those emissions, and whether or not they have in fact achieved them, and if they haven't, how they're going to correct that drop off from the previous year, just as you would when you were looking at, oh, we're going to increase sales in Azerbaijan next year, and they don't. You know, so transparency, concrete targets, that needs to come from a very clear roadmap that they set out about how that change is going to be achieved. And it needs to show what the elements in the value chain are. So the reason I'm hammering this home, Dee, is that most large companies, their own operations represents anywhere between, crudely, 3 and 20% of their footprint. Most organizations that make stuff have the vast majority of their footprint upstream in their supply chain. So if you take the world of fashion, for example, 85% of all carbon emissions, 84 in fact, happen upstream in the supply chain. And the bulk of the remainder is down to how customers use those clothes. So you can give customers guidance about using those clothes differently, caring for them differently, washing them less, saves them some money, by the way, keeping the clothes for longer. And you can dramatically reduce the carbon footprint downstream as well. So you have to understand, you need transparency about where the impacts are. You need targets that relate to those. You need a roadmap that shows how you're going to achieve that. And you need to see what the projected change over a period of time, it's called a waterfall chart, is. If a company doesn't have those basic tools and it doesn't use it to set transparent targets and then report on them every year, we need particularly shareholders, but citizens as well, and employees, to say, we don't want to do business with you anymore unless you're going to behave in the way that we need. So, and quite a lot of the clients I'm helping at the moment are looking at how they use the company that they keep to have a kind of a bigger change impact. So that's the way the world needs to go on that one.
Yeah, absolutely.
If I answered your question, it was
yes.
a bit of a multi-headed beast.
I just want to pick up on one thing you talked about, this roadmap, and I'm just wondering what your thoughts are in terms of a just transition. So, you know, how do we ensure that people, in particular those most disadvantaged in our society, are part of planning, you know, part of the planning process in building back better, in addressing, you know, net zero, or, you know, having emissions in the next 10 years, and really have a voice and have an opportunity to benefit in the green economy. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think the primary responsibility for building back better has to sit with government creating a framework. Because this is macroeconomics and politics brought together, and understanding the interplay between the reduction in some sectors, how you can offset the job reduction and the economic activity reduction by replacing it with something else, how geography matters in that, whether or not how you stop incentivizing some sectors, how you start to direct those incentives to others, how that's linked to a long-term vision. You know, all that requires a pretty joined up piece of government thinking, and maybe eventually before I'm dead we might actually see one. Within that context, most of the companies that I know and work with never ask me why anymore on the environmental stuff. They ask me how, but they're still all asking why on the social side, as a generalization, because it's very hard to see the same business case, and because proving impact on social issues is very, very complex, and in a lot of cases too expensive to do in a pure causal way, and because it makes business delivery a bit more complicated. So, you know, just to make this tangible so it doesn't all sound too theoretical, and Will and anybody else on the line who's ex-Unilever will relate to this immediately. Unilever made some choices about how it could do business upstream in its supply chain in a way that would help usually the smallest unit that they deal with, which is right at the top of the supply chain. So as a food company, a farmer is a classic example. And there's huge amounts of poverty and serious problems retaining people in farming, lack of land rights. We're talking here about, you know, all over the world. So Unilever decided that it wanted to operate in a way that would create a more stable income, increase the amount, the way in which the pie was carved up, so more of the pie went to the guy at the top of the chain. In some cases, you could increase their income by 3 or 4-fold, and still in absolute terms, it was a relatively small amount of money. But that meant managing a much more complex supply chain. It meant educating those people. It meant dealing with the volatility while they learned, them dealing with the fluctuation in yield while they learned, et cetera, et cetera. It's not straightforward. So it's a choice. So go back to what I said right at the beginning of this call. What's your intent and what are your beliefs? There's no way a company that is primarily driven by maximizing profit is going to even think about making a choice like that. It's more complex. And of course, it has a fantastically better impact on the most disadvantaged in the world, but it takes more work. And in the early days, there is some risk involved. So if you're a company, again, that has stepped back, absorbed those externalities and says, where else can we use as our scale for good? Then there's enormous opportunity in the social area. What you won't do is you won't have that operating in the joined up way that you would at a government policy level. So you wouldn't, for example, say, we're going to switch out of coal-fired and demand a renewables contract, and we want to make sure that we employ people putting solar panels on the roof. Because that's ultimately what a pure play Green New Deal proposition, the just transition piece, would look like. But it is about saying, let's think about, again, the multi-stakeholder model, where you're saying, how do we do no harm to the environment that we draw on in order for our business to exist? How do we have a positive social impact, not only through our products on our customers, but more widely and parts of the society that we deal with, whether it's society that we serve or the parts of society we draw in our supply chain. And there it's really about being very clear what contribution you want to make, picking a few that are really material to your business, and working for the long term on those changes. So they're some of the most satisfying, certainly from my time at Unilever, and also working with companies like Mars and Danone since I left. People get very fired up in the company about that kind of supply chain based positive social impact. But it's very difficult to demonstrate that you as a single organization have improved the outcome of a particular social group, because society is so complex. So it is more difficult, and it's not for the faint-hearted, but those businesses that do it build a kind of a benefit of the doubt at a very different positive level.
Yeah. And I think because of that complexity and maybe slightly more difficult to do and to prove, it really brings it back to the why you're doing it and being very clear on that and your motivation around it. And I'm always struck with just how passionate you are about our work at Blueprint, right? And a big core principle, and one thing that we very much anchor in our work, is the idea of the dignity and value of people. So So in terms of change, in particular, I guess we're seeing a lot of within organizations who are going on the purpose journey. We are also seeing transformation programs, in particular, coming through the current crisis that we're in. And while there is some linkages to purpose, I think the intent felt by many people is around cost cutting. And there is implications oftentimes for redundancy programs. How do you think about that, or can we reconcile the idea of becoming purpose-led alongside some large-scale cost-cutting agendas and initiatives?
Yeah, look, I think, nothing in business can insulate you from the realities of external factors outside your control that mean that your business might shrink at points, or that you deal with such fundamental changes. I mean, again, you look at banking. 30 years ago, the thought that you wouldn't really need branches that much, which is just mind-boggling. But the reality now is that, everything the bank does is spending our money. And does it make sense for them to spend our money maintaining jobs for places on lots of high streets that actually aren't used very much, that's a soul-destroying place to work? So change is inevitable. And I think, there's a fairly profound question, which, in fact, I've sat on a couple of CEO roundtables in the last 12 months, where those CEOs have genuinely said, how much of it is it our purpose at the moment simply to create and maintain jobs? And, the senior leaders that I've talked to are acutely aware of the impact of job reduction. But it is, I'm afraid, a fact of life. So I think the question for a purpose-led business or a responsible business, or whatever language that organization wants to use, is, are they sure that that's the route that is needed? And crucially, can they do it in a way that is transparent, that is honest, that is quick? Why would you want slow pain if you can have quicker pain? And that sets up those people that are going to have to leave the organization for a successful future. So, what I'd like to see there is a small amount more investment by those companies in transformation programs, in reskilling people in the areas where we know there will be growth sectors, because there are still a lot of growth sectors and there are decline sectors and there are lots of changing sectors, is to invest people so that they have useful skills for a future life. Because it's less about, I want to work for this company for life. Very few people have a mentality that either expect it or even think that's a healthy thing. It's much more about the transferability of your skills, and you feeling as if this one go you have on this planet is one where opportunities and doors keep opening.
Yeah, and I think companies have found themselves in a position where maybe they weren't thinking soon enough about this issue. I know COVID may have put additional pressure in, but this idea of the future skills of work and thinking about how they could create both the skills, deepen the skills, change the skills, but also more systemically about how you might create jobs in different kinds of ways. And I know Unilever are kind of thinking more systemically about how they might do that moving forward. And I think the other challenge that comes in when we look at transformational programs and, issues around cost and having to reduce costs in areas is where people have equated being purpose with being nice. And so all the nice stuff happens over here on purpose, and then we kind of shove out the other things over here, and there isn't the integrated thinking about actually what it means to be purpose-led.
Yeah.
So just a couple of quick questions, two more types of questions, and then I'll open up to the audience. So please do put in your questions in the Q&A. Measurement. Very high level, because I know we could have an entire topic on measurement, a whole session on measurement. But if you were an exec in a company, what early indicators would you look for within the company that would mark a real shift towards becoming purpose-led? And what questions would you be asking yourself and your team?
Yeah, so I think to boil it right down, if you have a clear sense of what the company's purpose is, that's great. But almost always you need a plan that underpins it, that tells people how you execute it, because people are not mind readers and businesses are very complicated things. But ultimately, it's very simple. Being purpose-led should drive different choices. And the leadership should be clear about the most important choices that they want to see being reframed. And then they need a mechanism for identifying whether indeed that is happening. And part of that, not all of it, but part of it really should be some kind of a plan. And that plan can stand alone to start with, but pretty quickly needs to get integrated into the business plan, so you don't have two competing plans, which was one of the big mistakes we made in the early years with the USLP at Unilever. And then you include it in business performance measurement, just like you do everything else. But the most important thing, again, is it comes back to the honest opening conversation with the leaders. Why are we doing this? What do we expect to be different? What problem are we trying to fix for this? Are we doing this because we've hit a crisis? Are we doing this because it's innate in us, but we want to kind of formalize and crystallize it? And what are the shifts really that we believe for our purpose are going to be the most important? And then you need to capture it and codify it and integrate it and measure it and remunerate on it and reward it and celebrate it and create a pull mechanism, a virtuous circle of change within the business.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we've noticed is that people are kind of looking at the measurement around purpose separate to actually the core business strategy. And then you get this whole surrogation.
Well,
and
then
then
you get
measurement,
competition. Yeah.
And you get like also just like, this is I think where sometimes the confusion between purpose and ESG comes in as well, because it's just seen as kind of, a tick box exercise around kind of some things, rather than actually what is it about the core business that we are doing differently to deliver on our purpose. So a couple of very quick, concise, rapid fire answers to these last three questions, and then I've got some questions from the audience. So the three questions are: what gives you cause for concern? What gives you hope? And what one piece of advice would you give your younger self in the early days of a Unilever Sustainable Living Plan?
Yeah. Well, what gives me cause for concern is a very long list I haven't got time to give you now. I wish we had the UK version of Biden rather than the UK version of Donald Trump running this country. I really seriously worry about how 13th hour we are before taking action on biodiversity as well, by the way, which is as bad a problem as climate. What gives me hope is that China is now coming on board. We have an American leader, and crucially, we have voters saying, I want to see leaders leading for change. And this is a dramatic change just in the last 3 years. We have investors walking away from sectors that they think are old news. And the money markets are very powerful. And when they shift very quickly. And advice to a younger self was just be bolder, be faster, be braver. Don't worry so much about what other people think. If they're usually the wrong people to be worrying about anyway. Just kind of get on with it and trust your gut really hard.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sue. And I'm going to open up now to the audience. So I've got Lydia. Can we unmute Lydia, please, so she can ask her question?
Hello. Yeah, I just need to remember what my question was. Hang on a sec. So it's all around female leadership and female kind of push really for purpose. I'm increasingly seeing that that's kind of what's really happening. So I'm wondering why you think that is, and how we might ensure that more males are on board, and kind of not just seeing it as the fluffy stuff and women are the nurturers, and that's kind of perhaps why we are driving this agenda. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, I haven't seen the same quite so marked gender split, to be honest, Lydia. I think
Good.
I'd say 2/3 of my clients are men. I think most of them are looking at the business case more than the moral case. By the way, I think that's essential because you're not going to change the way business runs purely on a moral case. That said, I think that a lot of the kind of the natural soft skills that you need to operate in this space are ones of collaboration, low ego, thinking differently about what the world could be. And it's a generalization, but that tends to be more common in women than it does in men. And I certainly find that when you look at chief sustainability officers, for example, increasingly, as you know, HR, partly for the old stereotypical reasons, but actually also because there's a genuine talent spike. A lot of them are women, but I don't have any worry, to be honest, about the gender representation in this whole area. All I really want is for people to connect with themselves as members of the human race and how they feel about, their time on this planet, and to recognize that that is a very powerful thing that they can bring into their work to add value rather than bury and manage separately.
Thank you, Sue. So we've got a man up next, Will. Hi, Will. You know Sue well.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Dee, and hi, Sue. Lovely to talk to you.
Hi.
So yeah, you said a few times I won't work with clients unless XXX, as it were, in terms of their commitment, for example, to halving the value chain carbon emissions by 2030. And I'm just kind of wondering, I mean, this is in some ways the age-old problem in this area, isn't it? But isn't it the case that sometimes you need to work with clients to gain their trust, to change their mindsets and help them overcome their own fears and blockers? And so, that first stage of working with them, that's partly about inspiring them and getting them to see the case for change, and partly about holding a mirror up to where they are. Do you find that sometimes that shifts them into a zone where you can start to work with them?
Oh, 100%. So there've only been a couple of very difficult conversations part the way through a project. But I haven't yet been in a position where it's been clear to me from the outset that whatever advice I give a client, I'm wasting my time. And always, as I said, I start with that kind of one-day workshop and take them on there, and they go on a very intense journey. And then, I've not had a client, I've had some who've said, we just don't know if this is feasible. And then you have the conversation about the benefit or otherwise of big, hairy, audacious goals versus kind of building something in a very concrete way, bottom up. But very few of them, and this is definitely a COVID white swan, come out of that intense process and that personal journey and say, yeah, that's all very well, but I just want to make money for the short term. And then frankly, if they were to do that, it would be a pretty easy decision, because given that I'm only interested in impact and they're only interested in the short term, we would never be happy bedfellows. But I also think, that clients self-select to some extent. It would be very exceptional for a completely ruthless, hard-nosed, I'm all about the money type client to find their way to someone like me and say, "Ooh, could you help us build a sustainability plan?" And I poke pretty hard at the motives in the very early days. And you have an instinct, don't you, for people's motives?
Absolutely. I think they'd probably go to a comms agency, right?
Exactly. Yeah, they just pop me some lipstick on the pig. And there, I hope more and more agencies do the same thing, which is, well, the lipstick's got to go on something else, frankly.
Yeah.
That's their choice, but that's what I hope.
One final question, Lauren.
Hello there.
Hi.
Hi, firstly, thank you so much for such a brilliant talk. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you. It's been very insightful and interesting. My question for you was, and I took your point at the end about your concern about the UK version of Biden versus Trump, but it's around regulation and what you think, as consultants in this space and for yourself, we should be asking for or seeking or contributing to in terms of the regulatory agenda. And just your thoughts on that at the moment, because it appears to me that you're absolutely right. There are two types of companies, one motivated by profit, but if we're going to avoid climate crisis, something needs to be done about those companies as well.
Yeah, so I think when I work with clients, part of what I get them to think about is how they go significantly beyond the basics of getting their own house in order. And I've talked about the full value chain element of that. The bit I haven't talked about, which is relevant, Lauren, to what you're asking, is how they use their voice as a progressive advocate for change. Because governments of all complexions, pretty much everywhere but China, is used to a system of lobbying, which, let's face it, exists primarily to stop change and defend the status quo. And the most extreme and disastrous example of that has been the oil sector lobbying, particularly in the US, for decades now. And government, and I worked on the executive team of a government department before I was at Unilever, so I've seen policy making right close up. And basically, it's a game of consensus and a war of attrition. So as a government come into power, they have a view about the policies that they want to introduce. But in order for anything to actually happen, you have to get more people to vote for it on the floor of the Commons and the Lords and vote against it. And in canvassing all the people that you want to agree to change it, you end up watering stuff down. But even worse than that, you don't even bother trying to get the change through unless you believe that it's going to get you re-elected and it's going to meet the popular demand of where your support base sits. And the bit that's entirely lacking until very recently is a concerted, reputable force for progressive change from business to government, creating consistent, actionable but ambitious pressure for policy change. And I think that move away from the old world of trade associations, which to me they have some marginal use but are very marginalized now, towards allegiances of companies on key issues that consistently push and engage government for the right kind of policy frameworks and regulatory change, and that recognize that ultimately what we need penalties for the wrong kind of behaviors and incentives for the right kind of behaviors. And when you boil it down, that's one of the key things that policy and regulation does, but that does it from the point of view of knowing that will be workable and it will have a rapid impact. And speed is the other really critical element here. We need those progressive voices from the CEOs of major businesses fast.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point to end on, because I think companies on this journey, we can see, initially they may work in the risk mitigation and think about that. Then they think about how do you innovate around new products and services and really start to think about how that can move you towards your purpose. But where they're really struggling is to shift that mindset into collective action and the opportunities that can create more broadly. And I think there's a huge area there that we need to get moving on pretty quickly in the next 12 months, in particular around climate, but also in terms of social issues. So we're at the hour, just past the hour. So I just want to finish by saying thank you so much, Sue. I'm incredibly lucky, I guess, to be working for Blueprint, but also to have had so much time with you as well over the last 24 plus months. I very much appreciate all the insights that you've given me personally, and the guidance that you've been providing for Blueprint. So thank you very much, and thank you for your time today. And then also to Sula and to Amelia, who've been behind the scenes and helping me on the administration side of this. So thank you. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening and get some sunshine.
Thanks for inviting me. Thanks everybody for coming and joining us. And I hope it's stiffened your sinews even more and your determination to be part of the change. Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.